Tonight on KQED Newsroom, even though she hasn't stepped down, the race is on to replace Senator Dianne Feinstein. We get the latest from our politics team on that story and the response to President Biden's State of the Union address. Plus, America continues its racial reckoning. How diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are making a difference in the workplace. Our chief DEI officer joins us. And we visit a charming San Francisco neighborhood where you can grab a snack and a stroll in tonight's edition of Something Beautiful. Coming to you from KQED headquarters in San Francisco this Friday, February 10th, 2023. Hello and welcome to the show. This is KQED Newsroom and I'm Priya David Clemens. We're going to kick off tonight with a look at politics across the nation and here in California. Not surprisingly, Democratic leaders applauded President Biden's State of the Union speech, while Republican leaders panned the address. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy called it one of the most partisan State of the Union addresses he'd ever heard, while Vice President Harris tweeted, "You made our nation proud, POTUS." So, in case you were hoping for some sign of unity this week, nope, our nation still seems to be as divided as ever. Joining me now are two members of our politics and government team, KQED senior editor Scott Shafer and KQED correspondent Marisa Lagos. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into the State of the Union and your excellent analysis that is to follow, let's listen for a minute to the back and forth that took place that night. It was pretty unusual.
Some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset. I'm not saying it's a majority. Let me give you, anybody who doubts it, contact my office. I'll give you a copy. I'll give you a copy of the proposal. That means Congress doesn't vote. Well, I'm glad to see you. And I tell you, I enjoy conversion.
So it was a raucous night. Scott and Marisa, let's hear your takeaways. Scott.
Yeah, this was a key moment for Joe Biden. The polls show that, he's not overwhelmingly popular, to say the least. A lot of people think he hasn't got much done, a majority of people. And so this is a chance for him to, lay out his agenda, but also just remind people all the things that did get done in a bipartisan way. The bar has been set pretty low for Joe Biden. I mean, could he read a teleprompter? Could he show energy, be energetic? And I think he cleared that bar pretty easily. That exchange he had with Republicans, was, kind of energetic. The question is, will it allay the concerns that his own party has about his age? He's 80 years old. He is the oldest president already, right? And yet he wants to run for another 4-year term. That puts a lot of pressure on Kamala Harris, who was sitting behind him as vice president. So, I think he did clearly say, look, we've gotten a lot done. The job's not done. Let's finish it. And he's making a real appeal to working class white voters, in particular, folks who have been drifting away from the party. And, also I was struck by what wasn't emphasized: abortion rights, the war in Ukraine, two things that have been a lot of discussion around.
Immigration got one line, right? But I think, to Scott's point, the beginning of the speech was pretty bad, actually. Like, he was reading, he's not the best teleprompter reader, but it almost was like the Republican pushback gave him this energy. And, Joe Biden's at his best when he is kind of sparring with people, when he is off the cuff. And I think we really saw that. I also think it's just funny, during Obama's term, a Republican was actually censured by the entire Congress for saying calling him a liar. Now we have Marjorie Taylor Greene going at it with him, and people, the White House seemed to enjoy it. I saw Nancy Pelosi afterwards say, actually, they were pretty well behaved for Republicans these days. So it just strikes you how much the tenor in Washington has changed.
Right, how the discourse is really slipping. And
then also just how progressive his platform is. I mean, I know Scott mentioned some things he didn't mention, but he did talk about gun control. He did really, dig in on climate change. And it strikes you how much the discourse of the past decade has really shifted the party left. So someone like Joe Biden would not have been pushing some of these policy proposals, I believe, a decade ago.
And quite a long passage about police reform as well. So that was, I think, probably, Tyree Nichols' parents were up there as special guests of the First Lady. So, there was really something for the left, for sure. We saw Elizabeth Warren clapping pretty enthusiastically.
Medicare, all of these social programs he talks about. It's definitely not the Joe Biden that we saw when he was the vice president, honestly.
Well, let's flip to the other party for a second. Kevin McCarthy's tenure as House Speaker has gotten off to a rocky start. How fractured is the Republican Party at this point?
I mean, it's interesting. The night after that, he raised over $12 million at a fundraiser that included some of his quote-unquote toughest critics, Jim Jordan, folks like that, other members of the kind of far-right MAGA wing of the party, as Joe Biden will call them. I think it remains to be seen. Obviously the debt limit, we have plenty of time to talk about that. It's going to be months before we're actually at that cliff. That's going to be one of the first key tests for McCarthy and to see. But it does seem like he and Biden at least have some sort of a relationship. I mean, Biden joked at the beginning, I don't want to get you in trouble with your caucus, but I would like to work with you. McCarthy, I think, seemed a little confused at times about whether he should clap or not, what he should do, because there was a split. You could see it among the Republicans on some of these issues. But, at the end of the day, McCarthy, we were just in Sacramento this week. People loved him there. He is seen as a nice person. And I think the question is, what McCarthy shows up publicly, but privately as well.
Very interesting. So anything in the State of the Union you think, particularly here in California, we should be paying attention to?
Well, I mean, a lot of the money that was passed in the infrastructure bill, for example, is now just being spent here. We had Pete Buttigieg, the head of transportation secretary, was out here, touting money that's going to be spent on the Golden Gate Bridge. And I think that's one of Biden's points is that, look, it may not feel like we've gotten anything done, but public transit, housing, all kinds of money that is going to be spent improving internet in more rural parts of the state and country. Those are things that hopefully for Biden's sake, between now and November 2024, people are going to begin to feel because there will be a lot of people hired to work on these projects. So a lot of that money will come and is coming to California.
So, Scott, we've had two consecutive House speakers from California now, Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi and now Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Does this say something about the power of California, or is it just it happened?
Well, a little bit of both. I mean, you couldn't find two more different human beings, I think, than Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. As Marisa said, Kevin McCarthy kind of got to where he is in large measure by being a nice guy, somebody who's affable, somebody who likes to be liked, someone who
was moderate.
He was moderate. He worked across the aisle when he was up in Sacramento. He's obviously a different Kevin McCarthy right now, especially with the very narrow majority that he's got. So, I do think that, both of them methodically worked their way up the ladder. I think it's somewhat coincidental that they're both from California, but then, you look at who's standing behind the president, it's the vice president's from here, the speaker was from here and is from here now. So, there is clearly, California's a big state, and, if you can do well here, you can do well elsewhere.
Well, let's turn to a spot that is being run for, even though it's not open yet, the California Senate spot, right? So Dianne Feinstein has not yet stepped down, but Representative Katie Porter has thrown her hat in the ring. Representative Adam Schiff has, and then Nancy Pelosi has recently released a statement saying, if Senator Feinstein decides not to run, I'll be supporting House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff, who knows well the nexus between a strong democracy and a strong economy. Does her endorsement come as a surprise since Feinstein hasn't yet signaled that she is stepping down?
Maybe on that, but I think it's pretty well understood. I mean, it would be shocking if Feinstein ran again. I think it's more surprising that Pelosi chose this early to back Schiff, to put her thumb on the scale, particularly considering we are still hearing that Barbara Lee, Oakland Congresswoman, served with Pelosi in the House for most of her time there, is also going to run. Schiff and Pelosi are very close. She lobbied for him to be appointed Attorney General when that spot was open in California. It's not surprising that she's allied with him, but I do think that this is a bit of a swipe at Barbara Lee, and clearly Katie Porter would have probably preferred she stayed out. I'm not a person who thinks that any one endorsement is going to lock up this race. It's going to be a long slog till next March.
I mean, given that he's at this point, the only male running, to get an endorsement from the most prominent woman in the party, if not the country, certainly matters more to him than it might to others.
Yeah. Didn't Governor Newsom at some point also mention that he would appoint a black woman to the seat
if she stepped down early?
If she stepped
Which
down early.
There does not seem to be any indications because she hasn't even decided whether she'll run again, apparently.
Yeah. All right. Well, you mentioned that you were in Sacramento this week, so let's talk about the news from the Capitol. Governor Newsom seems set for a fight on the fossil fuel industry. So let's talk about
he's been doing that. He's, also the gun industry, tobacco. So obviously, Newsom is, as we all were, concerned about high gas prices. He called for a special session, which is started. It hasn't seemed to be particularly special because not much is happening. He wants to put a penalty on excessive oil profits. And so a bill that he signed last year, SB 1137, which would limit where oil drilling and gas drilling can take place, not too close to homes and schools and clinics, is now facing a referendum. The oil industry has gotten enough signatures to put it on the ballot in November of 2024. Newsom, of course, very much will be campaigning against that, in favor of allowing that law to become effective. And it's going to be a real battle royal, because obviously big oil has a lot of money. But the environmentalists are going to be lined up against this, as will Newsom. So it's going to be a big deal. It's a kind of a no loss for him. I mean, people understand that these huge profits that the oil industry is getting now, as gas prices are high, natural gas prices are high. It's an easy sell, I think, certainly for Democrats.
And lawmakers are also exploring a constitutional amendment that could allow incarcerated people to vote. How would that change the political landscape?
I think to be determined. Whenever we open up voting to another group, the question is, will they actually vote? I think actually in prison you might have, a captive audience and people who it's easy to go out and say, hey, you should engage in this. But this is really I think we should position this as part of a broader conversation we're having in California and nationally that has to do a lot with reparations and our history of slavery and oppressing black people. A lot of these laws prohibiting felons from voting, people who are already out of prison, people on parole, and then of course people in prison, really came out of the Jim Crow South because there was this desire to not allow black people to have power. And so we've seen in a couple of years ago, voters agreed to let people on probation and parole vote. This is the next step, and we'll have to see it. It could go forward or it could take a couple of years. It will have to go to the electorate. And so I think that's where the real interesting debate would be.
Well, turning to, maybe we should say higher news. Assemblymember Matt Haney this week said that, quote, many people want to consume cannabis socially while having a sandwich or listening to music. We should allow that. So pot cafes, is that basically what we're talking about here?
Yeah, think Amsterdam.
Yeah.
When voters approved recreational use of marijuana in 2016, there were a lot of restrictions on that. There are, many hundred dispensaries throughout California, but they're very much limited to what they can sell. No food that's like fresh food or drink, only packaged things. And so Haney wants to change the law that would allow local governments to go ahead and have music venue, sell tickets to things, sell food, drink, non-alcoholic beverages. And part of that is because they're facing a lot of pressure, these dispensaries, from the black market. Because of the taxes and the regulation, a lot of people are just not going into these dispensaries because it's more expensive. And so Haney sees this as a way to maybe help them financially and take advantage of an opportunity, maybe bring more visitors into San Francisco who would, go to these kinds of cafes. And then San Francisco is also moving ahead, as has West Hollywood and some cities down south, to allow it if the state law changes. So we could see it. It's, if the governor signs it.
Let's turn to some big news from the San Francisco District Attorney this week, Brooke Jenkins. She has said that she wants to dismiss charges in a police shooting case unless California Attorney General Rob Bonta takes it up. Could you tell me a little bit about where this stands right now?
Yeah, so this is a shooting that occurred in 2017 when Chesa Boudin, her predecessor, was the DA, and he came into office promising to hold police accountable. And so now, she's decided, after looking more carefully at it, that she's going to dismiss it. She's handing off this hot potato to the Attorney General to see if he wants to take it up, which he may. They're looking it over. But, the family of the young man who was shot and killed by a rookie police officer on his fourth day on the job, after the suspect was allegedly had carjacked a van from the California lottery, that this officer, he fired a gun through his own windshield, violating training. And
they're mad.
No, they're mad. Yeah, the family's mad, and we'll see if the AG picks it up.
Scott Shafer, Marisa Lagos, thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Freya.
In the wake of the racial justice protests in the summer of 2020, there's been a wave of diversity efforts across higher education institutions and corporate America. Many of these fall under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what exactly does that mean, and why does it matter? I'm joined now by KQED's new Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, Eric Abrams. He comes to us after serving in similar positions at Stanford University and UC Berkeley. Eric, welcome to the show, and welcome to KQED.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
You are a month and a day into the job, and we are putting you in the hot seat here.
I think that's what I signed up for.
Well, tell us about that. DEI is a hot topic, but I think it's often misunderstood. What exactly is DEI? What are these efforts about?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I do think that the efforts are terribly misunderstood. To start with a really basic definition, diversity is just a fact. It's all around us. We're surrounded by people who have different backgrounds than we do, different faiths, different cultures, different ways of expressing their sexuality or different physical abilities. That's just a fact. There's nothing we can do about it. We can't change it. We can't make it worse or better or legislate it against it. I believe that equity and inclusion are goals. Equity is not the same as equality. It's not giving everybody the same thing and making the playing field completely level. It's actually giving people who need more a little bit more, and maybe giving people who need less a little bit less. To use an analogy, if you and I were together at a concert, it might be, equal for us to stand next to each other, but it's probably more equitable for you to stand in front of me so I don't block your view.
But when we go to a concert, we don't do that. We don't file in by height.
No,
we
no,
just
we don't.
go. So it becomes difficult. How do you know who gives and who takes and who deserves what?
That is a great question. And the idea of thinking about who deserves what, I think, is really at the crux of the controversy, right? When we talk about diversity in college admissions, people get entirely freaked out about the definition of merit, and we're going to take this less qualified Black or Latinx or Native American kid versus this more qualified white or Asian American kid. The question that I always ask myself is, well, who defines what merit is?
Sure.
Is a student who went to a high school that offered 20 AP classes, say, and they took a third of them and did really well in those classes, are they more meritorious than a student who went to a high school that had 2 AP classes and they took both of those, but because that student wanted to learn more, they supplemented their education with some community college classes or online learning? Who's more meritorious?
Hard questions. What is the goal of DEI efforts? Are we trying to make an equal playing field for everyone? Is that the goal of it? Is it acknowledging that there are differences and trying to find places for people to fit?
Certainly. I definitely want to acknowledge that there are differences. The last thing I would want to do is squash the differences between people. The differences are the fun part. That's what I enjoy learning about, the differences between or about people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different faiths of mind. That's really exciting to me.
We can see
personally.
it lights you up.
Right. It's really fun to learn about difference. Some people are threatened by that, though. Some people don't want there to be any difference, that we're all a monolith. Well, that's no fun, right? I don't want to eat the same thing every day. I don't want to hang out with the same people every day. I want to learn from difference. And I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are about creating space for all of us to learn from difference. One of the things sayings I use a lot is, my job is not to tell anybody how to think. My job is not to tell anybody what to think. I do think my job is to tell people to think, however.
That pushback, as you're talking about, we are seeing that play out across the nation. Just recently in Texas, from Governor Abbott's office, there was a memo that went out, and it said that using DEI policies in hiring violates both federal and state employment laws by illegally discriminating against, quote, certain demographic groups. It doesn't say which groups those are, but
Right.
Generally the thought is white people feel they're being pushed out and they're being no longer treated fairly and equally. What do you say to that?
I think that's an unfortunate misunderstanding. I'm certainly not about trying to make anybody feel worse or feel bad or push anyone out. I want to do just the opposite. I want to pull everyone in. I want to approach people like this. Come on, how do I learn from you? What is your background? Governor Abbott, as a disabled man, you've benefited from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So tell me, what is your position on why do you want to take these protections away from other people? Not in a way that's going to make him necessarily defensive. I genuinely want to know his opinions. And I think that if we can do that, if we can genuinely seek to understand where other people are coming from, even if we don't agree with them, we'll all be better off.
You've spoken about this concept in a term I like a lot, positive curiosity, right?
Yes.
And I think that often this work, this effort, is so laden with historical harms, systemic harms, institutional problems, that it is hard to see it as anything but very serious, very hard work. You are trying to bring a different perspective to it.
Absolutely. I think that it is hard work. I think we're talking about really, really serious subjects. But that doesn't mean we can't be joyful in doing the work. It doesn't mean that the concept that you mentioned, positive curiosity, I think we all have positive curiosity, and I think we know how to apply it. We just do it, and we don't do it. And I can give you an example. Priya, imagine that I've invited you to my home over for dinner. I love to cook. I'm not saying I'm a good cook, but I love to cook. I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking and I'm telling you about this recipe that my grandmother brought up from Mississippi when my family moved to Oakland in the Great Migration. And I serve the meal, and whatever kind of food you like, this ain't it. I mean, it is disgusting. At that moment, do you say, oh my gosh, this is terribly unfamiliar. What is this? Why did you put this in front of me?
Nope.
Or do you kind of gamely take a bite
Yeah.
and steer the conversation to, so your grandmother brought this recipe up, and what spices are these? Where did you find these spices? Did you go to Oaktown Spice Shop? I love Oaktown Spice Shop. It doesn't mean that you eat the meal. It doesn't mean that you agree with everything the other person is saying, but you can be positively curious about their thoughts and their feelings, and so that both people learn.
Sometimes people who are minorities feel, I'm tired of having to answer. I'm tired of having to tell you about my lived experience. Go find it in another form. What do you say to that?
Boy, do I understand that exhaustion. First of all, I really, really personally, deeply understand that exhaustion. But I would encourage people to try to extend a little bit of grace and kindness to people who come to them with questions. I think that if we immediately tell people to talk to the hand, nobody will grow. I can think of an experience from my own college years. Still have a good friend. We became friends because we were both interested in theater. And one day I asked him, hey, can you tell me about this yarmulke you're wearing? And he looked at me and said, yarmulke? And I said, on your head. He's like, you mean my yarmulke? I had seen the word, but I had never heard it. In the current zeitgeist, it'd be totally appropriate for him to say, talk to the hand, go educate yourself. Come on, you don't know anything. But because he extended me the grace of teaching me how to pronounce the word and telling me why it was important to him and his family and his story, I learned immensely, and we're still good friends. That's the spirit that I want to imbue to KQED and to everywhere I go. I want people to be able to be curious and to be able to ask questions. I think we all have questions about different ways of living than the ones we know. But the current zeitgeist doesn't allow us to ask those questions.
Cancel culture. Tell me about where these efforts stand right now. It's really a nascent field of bringing these sorts of programs into organizations, whether they're educational organizations or businesses. Where are we now, and where do we have to go?
Well, I think the field is under attack, and I understand it, but I think it's terribly unfortunate. I think there's so much we all have to learn, again, about different cultures, different backgrounds, so on and so forth. And to create space for people to learn those things in a relatively safe environment, who would be afraid of that? Why is that terrible? Why does that make you uncomfortable? Well, I can tell you why it makes you uncomfortable, because unfortunately I think there are a lot of people in my field who, I'll back up. I think there are a lot of diversity practitioners who set themselves up as having never made a mistake, and who also make people feel bad. They don't let people define themselves. There's a local university I'm very familiar with that is being sued right now because of a DEI training where they asked people to divide themselves into different ethnic groups, and then the facilitator told a couple of people, no, you're not in that group, you should be in this group. Well, people can define themselves by however they want to. That is not the role of the DEI practitioner.
Let's talk a little bit about equity now in a different forum. We've been talking about educational institutions and corporate institutions, but what about sports? You're a sports fan.
I'm definitely a sports fan.
Super Bowl is coming up this weekend. The NFL is nearly 70% black, and yet we have very few head coaches who are black, and this is going to be the first time ever we've had two quarterbacks who are both black. Tell us about your thoughts on equity in sports.
Oh, wow. I am a giant sports fan, and sometimes I feel like personally the NFL does not want me to be an NFL fan. I've lived in Oakland for decades, and the Raiders are in Vegas. The way that the NFL has treated, healthcare and concussions for retired players is shameful, and the whole Colin Kaepernick brouhaha is really embarrassing. Having said that, I do think that the league is trying to make at least performative efforts. You turn on a football game and stitched right behind every end zone, spray painted behind every end zone is end racism. Players now have, different tags on the back of their helmets that will say things like stop hate or Black Lives Matter. Tiny, tiny steps and definitely performative, but I think it's better than not doing anything at all.
Eric, thank you for your insight and for being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Eric Abrams, KQED's new Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Welcome to the organization again, and we hope to have you back on the show.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
While walking down Clement Street in San Francisco, you'll find mouth-watering cuisines from around the world and local businesses, such as the original Green Apple Bookstore. The Inner Richmond neighborhood is this week's look at something beautiful. Oh, I love the grab-and-go dim sum there, too. That's the end of our show for tonight. We're off next week, but we will see you right back here in 2 weeks when we sit down with choreographer and founder of San Francisco's Lines Ballet, Alonzo King. If you'd like to share your comments or questions for him, you can email us at knr@kqed.org. You can also find KQED Newsroom online or on Twitter, and you can reach me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook at Priya D. Clemens. Thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend.